I want to start with asking a trick question. Let me ask you this. Do we have constitutional rights? I can't see some of you, but if you think that we have constitutional rights, then just say yes. I mean, I won't hear you, but at least we'll know. And if you think we don't have constitutional rights, then say no. And then we'll just take it into the fact. Now, this is a trick question, just so you know. So let me give you a brief introduction to the Values Advocacy Council as we start. The VAC was formed in 2003, and its main focus was to get people, Christians, involved politically. It was mainly focused on getting pastors, in actuality, involved in politics. So what we've found out, that pastors are, of course, very afraid of getting involved in politics. And as a result of that, we had to change our focus and talk about and start recruiting Christians to be involved. So we started our organization in 2003, and in about 2015, I took over. And since then, the organization has grown, and now we meet at Calvary Chapel. We've had anywhere on average between 500 to 1,500 people at our meetings. We have had Mike Pompeo recently. Some of you might have been there for it. And we've had people like Judge Janine Carter and a bunch of people. And none of this was things that we planned. It sort of all came because after COVID happened, we all realized that we needed to gather together. And so the VAC sort of took off on its own. And I'll talk about some more about VAC. People have questions, but right now we're looking at expanding the VAC into other churches too. So so as a result of my involvement with pastors and finding out that pastors were not getting involved in politics, we had to, I actually wrote a book, and the book is called Jesus is Involved in Politics. Why aren't you? Why isn't your church? As we go through this talk, and this talk is kind of to explain a lot of that to you. So let's jump right into it here. As Pastor said, I was born in Ghana and I grew up in the Middle East and Africa. But I want to talk about a quick story about when I was in Yemen. My father was a professor at the University of Yemen, and he was working there, and I wanted to come to the United States. But while we were there, we suddenly had to flee the country. And the reason we had to flee the country is because a Muslim co-worker had borrowed a Bible off my father's desk at work. Now, why is this important? Well, simply because it is illegal to give someone who's not a Christian a Bible in Yemen. So let me ask you this. Do our rights come from government? Now, when I ask this question, suddenly you guys realize that the question about our constitutional rights was a trick question. Why? Because the government does not give us any rights. You see, the Constitution does not give you any rights. And Franklin was just about to go there. The Constitution does not give you any rights. In fact, there's not a single right that the Constitution or the Bill of Rights gives you. Now, there is an amendment that came later that sort of gave rights, but it was worded wrongly. But the Constitution does not give you any rights. In fact, if you look at the Constitution, you will see it's a list of restrictions. It's a list of, in a sense, negative rights. It says the government cannot do this, the government cannot do that, the government is not allowed to do this. It's not a list of the rights you have. Now, what would happen if you got your rights from government? Well, if you're thinking about it, you realize if our rights came from government, then government could legally, ethically, morally, and justly take away those same rights for any made-up reason, like they're doing today for your safety. So we see immediately it's very dangerous if our rights come from government. But where do rights come from? And most of you already know the answer to this.
From God.
If you think about it, how do we get to that point without using the Bible? Turns out we can. See, the only way you can have rights is if they come from somebody with the authority over all mankind. Who can tell the slave owner that he can't have slaves? Who can tell Hitler that he has to treat the Jews as equal? Well, the only person who can do that is the person with authority over the slave owner and authority over Hitler and all the Nazis and over every other human being in the world. Well, who is the only authority over every single human being in the world? That would be God, the creator of mankind, right? So that's what the Declaration of Independence says. And well, let me go to the next slide here. And we find that the Declaration says that our rights come from the creator. Now, here's the question that people say, well, wow, Jefferson, who wrote that Declaration of Independence, must have been a genius. Well, the reality is Jefferson didn't come up with that idea. Jefferson got that idea from these guys. In fact, he got it from a whole bunch of people. He got it from pastors preaching sermons for the 200 years before the Declaration of Independence was written. This is just an example of a few of them written a few years before the Declaration of Independence. But there are hundreds of pastors who have written. In fact, I have a class where I teach and where I quote all the different pastors. And when you look at those quotes, you see, wow, Jefferson just copied that when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? So we see that the Declaration of Independence and these pastors kind of indicate that our rights come from God. Okay, now, so rights come from the Creator, right? Now, here's something I think is very important that you understand. Rights come from God, but what God? You see, it only comes from the biblical Creator. You see, I have traveled all over the world and I've lived all over the world, and it's not just any God. Because the God of the Quran and the God of the Bhagavad Gita and the God or the gods of the Bhagavad Gita, there are thousands of them, and gods of any other religion do not say everyone has equal rights. It's only the God of the Bible that says that. So this is very important that we understand this. If you take the Bible or the Creator out of the equation, then there are no unalienable rights. No other religion gives you rights. So that means, here's something you have to be very careful about. If you separate the Creator, the biblical Creator, from our government, you lose all unalienable rights. And then the only rights you get are the rights that you got by force or because the masses decide to give you rights. And if the masses decide to give you rights, the masses can take away rights. Okay, now, so we don't get rights from the government. We get rights from God, right?
Amen.
But then what is the purpose of government? Why do I need a government? Well, the reason I need a government is said in the Declaration of Independence, says what? To secure those rights, governments are institutions among men, right? So we now realize that the sole purpose of government is to protect the rights, not that they gave us, but rights that we've already had from the Creator. Now, so what does that mean? Well, it leads to a bunch of issues. First of all, we all know that you can't separate politics from lawmaking, right? Politics is all about making laws. Okay. Well, guess what? You can't separate lawmaking from morality because it's immoral to violate somebody's laws, right? In fact, all laws are based on somebody's moral values. The question is, whose moral values should we be legislating our laws on? It turns out that we should be legislating our laws based on God's moral values. So third, you can't separate morality from a moral authority, right? The biblical Creator, because since all gods are legislated based on the objective moral law of God, where do we get the objective moral law of God? You get it from the biblical Creator. Remember, you don't get it from the Quran Creator because he doesn't give you rights. You don't get it from the Hindu creators because they don't give you rights. In fact, they have a caste system there. You don't get it from the Buddhist Creator because there is no Creator in Buddhism. It's pretty much atheistic. And you certainly don't get it from any atheistic thing because there is no God. There is no authority, so there are no rights. So what does that mean? That means you can't separate the biblical, and also it means that you can't separate the biblical Creator from Christianity or the church, which means that you can't separate politics from Christianity and the church. You cannot separate politics from Christianity and the church. And this is so important that we understand that. Because if you separate that, then everything falls apart. Now, I know what some of you are thinking about. Wait a minute. Are you saying that we want a theocracy? No. We don't want a theocracy as defined by man. We're quite clear about that. We definitely don't want a church government. I mean, as I say, Presbyterians don't want a Baptist government. Charismatics don't want a Baptist government. Assembly of God don't want a Baptist government. Seventh-day Adventists don't want a Baptist government. Crying out loud, Baptists don't want a Baptist government, right? They know that they won't. So we don't want a Christian government. What we want is Christians in government. You see the difference? We don't want a church government. We want a moral government, God's moral laws. And these are very important. Now, if this is true, if we don't want a church government, but we want a moral government, who better to instruct the world on moral values and moral instruction than pastors? Who better to come up with our laws than pastors who love the law of God? Who better to make the laws that line up with the laws of nature, nature's God, than those who believe in those laws and that God? And in line with that, what sort of person are we to vote for? What does the Bible say? Well, in Exodus 18:21, God clearly tells us through Jethro and Moses that you should select from all the people competent men who reverently fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain. You shall place these over the people as leaders, officials of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And this is actually the root of the representative government that we see in our Constitution. Okay. Now, what are rights, though? I mean, we're talking about, we have inalienable rights. The Declaration of Independence talks about our rights coming from God, and the Constitution is written to protect our rights. But what are rights? I mean, is healthcare a right? Is education a right? Well, we know some of these: freedom of speech, freedom to own property, life, liberty. But these are just examples of rights. How do I define and determine what a right is? Well, for instance, some people are going to argue, well, healthcare is a right because everybody should have the right to good health. Some people say, well, education is right because everybody should be able to be educated. So I want to train you real quick. Don't get confused between rights and goods, okay? Rights are things that God gives you. Goods are different. Goods and services are the product of someone's labor. So it's critical to differentiate two. Here's an easy way to look at it. If a right depends on someone else's work, service, or money, it's not a right. It's a good or a service. And it's certainly not a God-given or constitutional right. Okay? So for example, FDR, for instance, tried to create a second Bill of Rights. In that bill, he wanted to include things like the right to a good education, the right to health care, the right to your own house, the right to a good paying job, and the right to adequate food, clothing, and recreation. Now, sounds all great, right? But if you have a thinking hat on, you'll immediately realize while these are nice things, they all violate the very concept of God-given unalienable rights. Why? Because while you may have the right not to be prevented from having education, you don't have a right to be given a free education. Why? Because that education will be dependent on someone else providing the labor to give you that education. Same for food. Someone had to grow that food. Same for if somebody has to harvest and clean it. So where did you get that harvesting and cleaning? Where did you get that food from? Because if you're going to take it from somebody else, then you are stealing from the other person. For instance, if you say everybody has a right to an education, where are you going to get the education from? Are you going to go out there, capture a number of teachers, whip them, and enslave them until they give you a good education? If you say, well, healthcare is free, are you going to go out and kidnap a bunch of doctors and beat them until they give you good healthcare? Because where else are you going to get it from? Now, of course, we're not going to do that. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to enslave all the people, take 30% of their labor, salary, wages, which is the same as labor, and pay it for other people who didn't earn it. So what you're doing is you're stealing from one group of people and giving to another group of people. So you understand the difference. The right to bear arms is not the right to be given a free firearm. You have to buy your own gun. The right to free speech is not the right to be given a free printing press or a website. You have to go buy your own printing press. You have to pay for your own website. The right to the pursuit of happiness is not a guarantee of happiness. I hope you see the great difference. This is critical. Whenever you vote on something, ask yourself, is this law acknowledging a true right, or is it mandating that we give goods from one group of people to another group of people? Or are we mandating that we take money and labor from one group of people to pay for free services for another group of people? Because that's not rights. That's a violation of rights. That's a violation of the rights of the person who did the work. You always have the right to the fruit of your own labor, but never to the fruit of somebody else's labor. You see, quite simply, goods that are granted as rights, require you to enslave men fiscally, that's financially, or physically, to ensure a continuous supply of the goods that you have promised to others. Now, sadly, most Americans don't know the difference. And they think there's a scale between what the government should provide and what they shouldn't provide. But there is no scale. Rights are rights and goods are goods. But you see, all these are moral issues. And ignoring these moral issues causes oppression, which is unloved. Now, somebody might think, wait. Are you saying taxes are wrong? No, I'm saying taxes or fees for services that you require are fine. If you own a car, you pay fees for using the road. If you own a house, you pay fees for the sewage and the police and the fire protection in the same ratio of what you need. You have a heavier car, you pay a bit more for the road because you beat up the roads more. You have a bigger house, you need more protection, then you pay more. That's not socialism. That's fees for services. We should understand that. There's a big difference. Furthermore, socialism refutes the Bible. Bible says that all men are inherently lazy and greedy. Remember the 7 deadly sins? Right? We're all greedy and lazy. But socialism says all men will work as much as they can and take as little as they need. Right? But the reality is, what does the Bible say about sin nature? Instead of all men working as much as they can and taking as little as they need, all men tend to what? Work as little as they can and take as much as they can. And now you see why socialism always goes bankrupt and you end up with Venezuela. What happens? It dooms you to bankruptcy. People, I mean, Venezuela used to be one of the richest countries in South America. And look at it now. They had oil coming out of the earth. They still have oil coming out of the earth, but nobody's working. Why? Because everybody is taking as much as they can and working as little as they can. And the worst thing is the poor stay dependent. Now, somebody might go, wait a minute. You're just taking Venezuela. What about Sweden? Well, Sweden is actually not a socialist country, but they have a lot of socialist programs. In fact, the Swedes themselves, once ABBA left Sweden, realized that socialism wasn't working, and they decided to change. So they're not a socialist country anymore, but they have a lot of social programs. And with all those social programs, it turns out that with all those adjustments and benefits, Sweden is actually poorer than all but 12 US states. In other words, most American states are richer economically than Sweden. And England is poorer than all 50 states. And England has actually done more social programs than Sweden and is in the worst state. Now, you go, wait a minute, what about the poor? I mean, if we abandon socialism, who takes care of the poor? Well, Christ often talked about taking care of the poor. James, if you remember, said that true religion includes taking care of the widows and the orphans. And as a result of this, people say Jesus was a socialist. Right? I had somebody post this picture on my thing and said, well, Jesus said, feed the poor and take care of the sick. So Jesus was a socialist. Well, so I asked him, where did you get this idea that we should take care of the poor? And of course, everybody knows that the way where people got this idea was from the Good Samaritan. The story of the Good Samaritan changed society. I mean, not very many people realize this, but before the Good Samaritan, there were no charities. None of the charities took care of anybody who was not related to you. You took care of people that were in your family, or you took care of people who could pay you back in the future. But there was no charity designed for people who could never repay you until the story of the Good Samaritan. So let's remember the story of the Good Samaritan. What is loving my neighbor? Well, it is taking care of him. But notice that there are two others in the parable, the injured man, of course, but then there's also the innkeeper. We tend to forget the innkeeper in this story. So remember how the story goes, right? The Good Samaritan's walking down the street. He sees a man who was injured, and he picks him up. He puts him on his donkey. He takes him to the innkeeper. He takes him to the innkeeper, and he says, Mr. Innkeeper, this man has been hurt as in acting love of because I love the poor and the sick. I am going to pay for him, but I'll pay half of him now, half of what I owe you now. And I want you, Mr. Innkeeper, to share the cost and pay the other half. Is that the story? No, that's not the story, is it? Yeah, you're right. That's not the story. The story is, he says, Mr. Innkeeper, here's half of the money. When I come back, I am going to bring some thugs that I've hired, and they're going to beat up your neighbors and collect the money, the other half of the money from them. Is that the story? No, you're right. That's not the story. The real story is he says to the man, the innkeeper, hey, Mr. Innkeeper, here's half of the money. I'm going to come back in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to bring the IRS, and they're going to bring guns and badges, and then they're going to collect the rest of the money from your neighbors. Is that what you're like? Wait, no, that's not the story. What is the story? The Good Samaritan says, when I come back, I will voluntarily pay the rest of the money. Mr. Innkeeper, this is not your job. You didn't sign up for this. You don't need to pay a dime. Your neighbors don't need to pay a dime. I will pay for it. See, what Jesus was saying, what? He said, you give to the poor, not force your neighbor to. He never said, go and force your neighbor to. And you think about it, socialism is nothing more than forcing your neighbor to give to your favorite charity at the point of an IRS agent's gun. There is nothing in the Bible that allows you to not love your neighbor so much as to force him to pay for something that you think should be paid for. If you want to take care of the poor, you should. But what Jesus is saying, it is not the state's job to take care of the poor, it's the church's job. It is our job to take care of the poor. And we've done a very good job of that. Over the years, we've done an excellent job, and we are much more efficient than the government. A few years ago, if those of you guys are in San Jose, you know about City Team, I got this letter in the mail. It said it costs the city between $40,000 to $60,000 to care for a homeless person. It cost City Team $12,000. I went and I did the study, the calculations on this and a whole bunch of other ministries and a whole bunch of other government programs, and I found out that if you give the government $1, 85 cents of that goes to government employees, government buildings, government retirement programs, and 15 cents gets to the poor person. If you give $1 to a charity, 85 cents goes to the poor person, 15 cents goes to the ministry. And yeah, there are some ministries that take more than that, and you don't need to give them. But try not giving to the IRS, and they will give you free food and clothing for the rest of your life. Now, this explains why socialist countries are poor. It takes 6 times as much labor to get the same amount of goods and services. And then people get tired for the government beating them up to take their last dollar so that they can use 85% of that on themselves. So it is actually unloving to let the government continue to be in the business of charity when we could help 2 to 5 times the number of needy people with the same amount of money. But here's the thing you should remember. We can't get there overnight. Because otherwise people will be dying in the streets. Everybody's become so dependent on the government. Even churches are taking money from the government and distributing it, which is the worst thing you can do. Because then the church are behest, are at the mercy of the government, because their whole program exists on the government giving them money. So the church must first take back its leadership and resume its proper role. Turns out that's not too hard. The church has to step in and do this. Okay, now, I was talking to somebody and said, well, Neil, you're crazy because you're thinking your church can take care of the poor. He says last year, the national budget for welfare and taking care of the poor was $1.2 trillion. Are you telling me that your church can raise $1.2 trillion? I said, no, well, the first thing is we don't need to raise $1.2 trillion. If my calculations are correct, we can do the same amount of work for $200 billion, 1/6 of it, right? So for $200 or $250 billion, we can replace 1/3 of the US budget. I go, well, $200 billion. And he laughed at me. He said, $200 billion. Where's your church going to come up with $200 billion? I said, easily, because last year, the church and conservatives gave over $410 billion to charity. That, by the way, is 9 times more than the next closest with the Germans and 11 times more than the next closest with the Italians. Yes, we can. All we have to do is give 50% more. Right? America is the most giving people in the entire world. They give more than what they have to any other group or nation. And by the way, this is not from corporations. You'll see corporations are only 4% of that in the picture, right? Individuals are 75% and charity groups. And it's just, this is not something that we can't do. And the other thing is when you have a charity doing the work, guess what? They're also preaching the gospel. And they're bringing in people into the light. Okay. I was once teaching this class and a young girl shot up her hand and she said, well, that's all well and good, but Jesus wasn't involved in politics. That's when I realized I have to write this book called Jesus is Involved in Politics. Well, she said Jesus didn't get involved in politics. He didn't try to change the laws of Rome. He said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's. And Jesus didn't do it, we should do it. Well, the crowd went silent. Was she right? Let's look at it. Well, first, just because Jesus didn't do something does not mean that we should not. Jesus did not fight against slavery or racism either, right? He never got involved in banning slavery. Does that mean we should not have fought slavery? He didn't get married. He didn't start any new technology. Does that mean we should not start any new technology? Should we all be Amish, right? But on the other hand, if Jesus did do something, maybe that's a good reason for us to do it. Okay? So, the complaint is Jesus didn't get involved in politics. Well, turns out this is false and a complete misunderstanding of history. You see, remember when we were governing Iraq, right? We didn't run Iraq. We didn't run all their elections. We didn't run all. Why? Because it would be way too much work. So we only had two countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, that we were governing. Well, the Romans had probably 20 countries, if not more, that they were governing. There was no way they were going to run each of the. They didn't even have soldiers. They had to hire mercenaries to do all their wars because they didn't have enough people. Rome was a socialist country. So most of their citizens didn't want to do any work. So they had to hire it all out. And that's how they got more money, by conquering other nations so they could feed their citizens their socialism. Reminds you of the Communist Party, the CCP, what they're doing now, right? Getting money from other places so they can fund their expansions and their programs. But here's what's important about it. Because they couldn't run all that, the Romans let the Jews do all their local politics. So now, could Jesus get involved in Roman politics? Could an Iraqi citizen get involved in American politics? We were governing Iraq. No, because he's not an American citizen. He's an Iraqi citizen. So could Jesus get involved in Roman politics? No. Why? Because he's not a Roman citizen. He's a Judean citizen. So now, let's ask the question. If he was a Judean citizen, did they have their own political structure? Of course they did. In fact, he would have had a complete legal system. They had a president, which would be Herod, and then they had senators and representatives. Remember that quote from Deuteronomy? They had that entire system running in Judea while Jesus was living there. Now, so the question is, did he have a governing body? Well, it turns out he did. Here's the governing body they had. It was called the Sanhedrin. Well, who were the Sanhedrin? Well, the Sanhedrin means sitting together, means hence assembly, is a name given to the council of 71 Jewish sages who constituted the Supreme Court and legislative body of ancient Israel. The makeup of the council included a chief justice, a vice chief justice, and 69 general members who sat in the form of a semicircle when in the session. So he had 71 of these guys. Now, do you think he ever talked to any of these 71? Did he ever talk about legislative issues? Did he ever argue with them? Or do we never hear about them in the Bible? I'm hoping you're all about 30 seconds ahead of me. Yeah, he did. He interacted with these people. He talked to these people because these people were called what? The Pharisees and the Sadducees. In fact, who did Jesus spend most of his time arguing with? The Pharisees and the Sadducees. And he's using civil disobedience, harvesting wheat on the Sabbath, healing on the Sabbath. In fact, for those of you who know, our church is the finest church in America. We're the finest church because we have the most fines than any other church. We have about $4 million in fines. And when we had a press conference, I said, the Pharisees and the leaders and their religious leaders and their legislative leaders told Jesus not to heal on the Sabbath. And Jesus did exactly that. And so we, as Christians, have to disobey you and obey Christ's laws in assembling and healing and ministering on the Sabbath, which is Sunday. And so we're going to keep our church open, right? See, Jesus is not only involved politically, but he's using civil disobedience, and he's telling the Pharisees that the laws or interpretation were unjust. Now you might say, wait a minute, but he was just talking about religious things. No, he was talking about legal things, because he said, you have forgotten the three things of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Well, what's justice? Not God's justice, their justice. Mercy, not God's mercy, but their mercy for the people that were caught. And then faithfulness to God's law. He says, look, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. You've taken the law out of context. Go back to the original interpretation of God's law. He was a strict constructionist, which is what our judges should be, but they're not, sadly. And then I was sending an email out, and I said something bad about the president. This is back in 2012, so you can think of who the president was. And somebody wrote back to me and says, you should never say bad things about our president. Jesus would never condemn his rulers. And I said, yeah, I don't know about that. I said, I can't remember him calling them whitewashed tombs and a pit of snakes. Who will save you from hell? And then he calls his chief politician, Herod, right? The president says a sly fox. By the way, a fox back then, here we think of a fox as a clever person. Back to them, a fox was a dirty, stinking, thieving rat. So you see, getting involved in the lawmaking process and civil disobedience is modeled by Jesus in the New Testament and the very folks who wrote the Bible. Okay, let's close this up with a couple more objections here. One, it's not the job of the church to get involved in politics. Well, if you say that, then you got to talk to William Wilberforce. He was appalled as a Christian man by the concept of slavery. He worked for 40 years in British Parliament to abolish slavery, and he did so finally in 1807. Right? He stopped the slave trade, and that happened before it came here. But it's not only that. Think about this. If you say Christians should not get involved in politics, if you say we should stay out, the church should stay out of politics, then you're saying that every one of these laws should still be legal. Slavery, racism, every one of these things should still be legal. Slavery, racism, kidnap brides, child labor, gladiatorial combat, death games, infanticide, child marriage, temple prostitution, child sexual abuse, child prostitution, wives' property, cruel treatment of prisoners, inequality of man, all of these and thousands of laws. And I have 20 more of these listed in my book. But all of these and thousands of laws will only change because the church and Christians and pastors got involved to change the laws. How heartless could you be to say we should not be involved in politics? Let me close this. It's not only the people, but the church. When William Wilberforce got involved in politics, it was his church and Pastor John Newton that became the center of the activism against slavery. Why is your church not a center of activism against bad and immoral laws? And this is what we should do. Now, let me close with an encouragement. We can win this battle. You know, we talked about last year, we've seen where we had, we were worried about the cheating by Dominion and all that. Well, turns out that we really should not have to worry about that. You see, there are 60 million, over 60 million evangelical Christians are voting age in America. Yet in most elections, only 20 million vote. That means 40 million of us don't vote. Look, they can cheat by 3 million or 4 million. But if there are like 30 million people more voting for the right thing, we can change this overnight. There's no good reason for abortion to be legal. It's our fault because we're not out there. And here's the other good news. It turns out that only 3.5% of a minority is needed to change the laws. Look at what the homosexual lobby did. They were less than 2% of the population. And they've changed all our laws and the transgender laws. So let me encourage you. Here's what I want you to do. God is sovereign. But remember the children of Israel, the Assyrians and Babylonians, and many other nations, God held them all responsible for choosing their way into destruction. Will he do likewise for us? Right? With our freedoms to evangelize being taken away, we need, as a church, need to rise up. It's all in our power. Because if we don't rise up, I fear one day in the future, like my father told me so many years ago, we have to leave this country and go to another country because I gave a Bible to a non-Christian. Why? Because it's illegal to give someone who's not a Christian a Bible in the United States of America. But just remember this. I escaped to come here. But if we lose freedom here, there is no place to run to. This may be the last time on earth. Thank you very much.